In the final months of World War II, a strange truth began to unfold across the battlefields of Europe. Entire divisions of German soldiers, men who had once sworn allegiance to Hitler and fought fiercely for the Third Reich, were laying down their arms not to the Soviets, who crushed them from the east, but to the Americans advancing from the west. It wasn't a few hundred, or even a few thousand. It was nearly 500,000 men, all choosing surrender over survival on the front lines. And the question is, why? This is the untold story of how fear, desperation, and cold calculation led hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to make a decision that defied everything they had been taught to believe. It's a story about human instinct, propaganda, and the terrifying reputation of the Red Army that changed the course of surrender in 1945. To understand why German soldiers surrendered to the Americans in such staggering numbers, we need to go back to the final year of the war, 1944. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was breaking apart. The Allies had landed in Normandy, the Soviets were pushing deep into Eastern Europe, and the Reich that once dreamed of a 1,000-year empire was now fighting for days, even hours of existence. For most German soldiers, the war no longer made sense. Many were barely out of their teenage years. They'd been told that the Americans were weak, that they couldn't fight without machines or air support. But when the U.S. Army landed in France and swept across Europe with tanks, aircraft, and unrelenting firepower, that illusion shattered. Still, the Germans didn't surrender immediately. For years, Nazi propaganda had drilled into their minds that surrender meant shame, dishonor, and death. The Gestapo executed anyone suspected of desertion. Entire families were punished if a soldier refused to fight. But in 1945, when the Allies crossed the Rhine and the Soviet Army entered Germany from the east, something changed. The fear of defeat was replaced by something far darker, the fear of the Soviets themselves. The Germans had seen what the Red Army had done in the East, revenge for years of Nazi atrocities, towns burned, civilians slaughtered, women assaulted. Every rumor, every whisper of Soviet brutality spread like wildfire among the German ranks. The Soviets were coming for vengeance, and no one wanted to be caught in their path. To the West, however, things were different. The Americans, despite their overwhelming power, treated prisoners with a strange sense of order. Word spread quickly through the ranks that surrendering to the U.S. Army might actually mean survival. German POWs captured by Americans were often fed, given water, even allowed to write home. Compared to the horrors of the Eastern Front, it felt almost humane. By early 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. Entire German units began retreating westward, not to fight the Americans, but to find them. Their officers sometimes pretended they were still fighting, but the real goal was clear: reach the Americans before the Soviets reached them. The decision wasn't heroic, it was survival. Imagine being a German soldier in those final days, marching through ruined cities, starving, exhausted, hearing distant artillery in both directions. Behind you, the Red Army's advance meant possible execution. Ahead, the Americans offered something that, by comparison, looked like mercy. For many, the choice was obvious. By April 1945, the American forces had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into Germany. Thousands of German soldiers began approaching U.S. lines with white flags, waving handkerchiefs, shouting, "Nichts schießen," don't shoot. American soldiers were stunned. In some areas, German troops came in such large numbers that U.S. officers had no way to process them. Field camps overflowed. Trucks lined up for miles. Some German commanders negotiated mass surrenders just to prevent chaos. And yet, for these men, surrender was not only an act of desperation, it was a psychological release. For years, they had lived under the shadow of a regime that demanded absolute loyalty.
Now with the Reich collapsing, Hitler's promises of victory sounded hollow. The Nazi leadership told them that death was better than surrender, that fighting to the last man was an honor. But most soldiers no longer believed it. They just wanted to go home, alive. The difference between surrendering to the Americans and to the Soviets could mean everything. German POWs under Soviet control often vanished into the gulags, never to return. Those captured by the Americans, on the other hand, were sent to POW camps across France, Belgium, and the U.S. itself. They were forced to work, yes, but they were also fed, treated medically, and eventually released. Some even stayed in America after the war. So why did this massive surrender happen on such a scale? It was not just fear of the Soviets or respect for the Americans, it was also a matter of perception. By 1945, the German people had been bombed relentlessly. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were in ruins. The population was starving, exhausted, and terrified. Yet even through that despair, many Germans believed the Americans were fair. The propaganda that had painted them as monsters was collapsing under the evidence of reality. Soldiers who had been captured and later released spread the word. The Americans treat prisoners well. They give you cigarettes, food, even coffee. These stories became like lifelines. In the chaos of collapsing fronts, they passed from unit to unit, whispered between soldiers in the trenches, shouted across roads. For many German officers, surrendering to the Americans wasn't just about saving their men, it was about saving themselves. Some high-ranking officials saw surrender as their only chance to survive and rebuild their lives after the war. Others hoped to use it as leverage, believing that cooperation with the Americans could one day protect them from Soviet retribution. There were also those who thought ahead. They knew that once Hitler was gone, the real threat would be the division of Germany itself. Surrendering to the U.S. might keep the nation in one piece, or at least under a Western influence that seemed less brutal than Stalin's. But for the average German soldier, it was simpler than politics or strategy. It was hunger, exhaustion, and fear. The war had turned into a nightmare they could no longer understand. Many hadn't seen their families in years. Some didn't even know if their homes existed. To them, surrendering to the Americans meant a chance to live another day. When American troops entered German towns, they often found soldiers waiting with white cloths tied to their rifles. Some were crying. Others stood silently, their faces hollow from years of war. The Americans didn't always know what to do. They were fighting a war that still raged elsewhere, but here, the enemy was giving up faster than they could advance. In a single week, entire divisions laid down their weapons. Columns of prisoners stretched for miles. One U.S. unit reported capturing 100,000 German soldiers in just a few days. The sheer numbers were staggering. So many men that American logistics couldn't handle them all. Temporary camps were built in open fields surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by exhausted American soldiers who could barely believe what they were seeing.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But for the 500,000 German soldiers who had surrendered to the Americans, their story was only beginning. They were no longer soldiers of the Third Reich. They were prisoners of war. And yet, compared to what awaited those captured by the Soviets, they were the lucky ones. The Americans faced a problem no army in history had encountered on such a scale: how to manage hundreds of thousands of surrendered men scattered across a continent in ruins. Towns were destroyed, supply lines stretched thin, and food was scarce even for the victors. Yet now they were responsible for feeding, guarding, and sheltering an army of defeated enemies. The first weeks after surrender were chaos. German soldiers were herded into makeshift enclosures, fields surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by young American troops barely older than the prisoners themselves. There were no tents, no barracks, no beds, just open ground under the changing sky. These were not yet proper POW camps. They were temporary holding zones created out of necessity, called Rheinwiesenlager, or the Rhine Meadow camps.
For the captured Germans, the experience was surreal. Some had expected harsh punishment, even execution, but the Americans, following orders from above, maintained strict discipline. Violence was rare, though conditions were rough. Food rations were minimal, medical care limited, and sanitation poor. For men who had fought for years, surviving on what little the front could offer, it was a new kind of endurance test, one without guns, but filled with uncertainty. At night, they huddled together for warmth. Rain turned the ground into mud. Many still wore tattered uniforms, some without boots. Yet despite these hardships, one feeling overpowered all others: relief. Relief that they were alive. Relief that the war was finally over. Relief that they were in American hands, not Soviet. For most, the Americans were a mystery. Propaganda had told them that Allied soldiers were brutal, that surrender meant torture or death. But those stories quickly dissolved. The American guards were strict, but they followed rules. When food arrived, it was distributed equally. When someone fell ill, medics were called. And most shocking of all, some American soldiers even talked to them, offering cigarettes, chocolate, or bread when they could spare it. In the ruined heart of Germany, small acts of humanity felt like miracles. But the Americans were overwhelmed. The sheer number of prisoners made it impossible to maintain comfort or control. The camps overflowed. In some areas, there were 10 prisoners for every guard. The U.S. Army had expected victory, but not surrender on this scale. The Geneva Convention outlined rights for POWs, but those laws hadn't anticipated the collapse of an entire army in a few weeks. Even so, American command made an effort. As the front stabilized, they began transferring prisoners to more organized camps in France, Belgium, and even across the Atlantic. Thousands were shipped to the United States, places like Texas, Georgia, and Kansas. There, the story changed dramatically. Life in an American POW camp was almost peaceful compared to the chaos in Europe. Prisoners were housed in wooden barracks, given clean clothes, regular meals, and access to medical care. Many were even assigned to work programs, farms, factories, and road construction, where they earned small allowances they could use to buy soap, tobacco, or stationery. At first, they couldn't believe it. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as savage, greedy, and godless. But here, in the heart of the country they were told to hate, they found fairness and even respect. Some American farmers, whose sons were still fighting in the Pacific, treated the German prisoners with surprising decency. One former Wehrmacht soldier later recalled, "When I worked on that farm in Georgia, the farmer's wife brought us lemonade every afternoon. I thought it was a trick, but it wasn't. She was just kind. That moment changed my whole understanding of what we had been fighting for." Stories like this spread through the camps. For many Germans, it was the first time they saw their enemies as human beings. And for some Americans, it was the first time they realized that their enemies were not all fanatical Nazis, but young men like themselves, caught in the machinery of war. Still, the guilt of the war lingered. When news of the concentration camps reached the prisoners, many were stunned into silence. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down, ashamed of what their country had done. The photographs of liberated camps like Buchenwald and Dachau circulated among the prisoners, shattering whatever pride or denial remained. In some camps, American officers forced the POWs to watch documentaries about Nazi crimes. It was not punishment, it was a lesson. The war had ended, but the moral reckoning was just beginning. Meanwhile, in Europe, the situation for German prisoners remained uncertain. Many were still confined in open-air camps along the Rhine, waiting for transfer. Disease and hunger took a toll. The Americans did what they could, but resources were stretched thin. The focus of the Allied command was shifting from fighting Germany to rebuilding it. Gradually, conditions improved. Red Cross visits began, supplies increased, and prisoners were allowed to send letters home. For the first time in months, they learned what happened to their families. Some discovered that their towns no longer existed. Others learned that their parents were alive but barely surviving amid the rubble. By late 1945, the U.S. began releasing the first wave of prisoners. Many were handed over to French or British control for labor projects. Others were returned directly to Germany, now divided into occupation zones. The return home was bittersweet. They came back to a country unrecognizable. The cities they had once marched through in triumph were reduced to ruins. The flags and emblems of the Reich were gone. American jeeps and British trucks rolled through the streets, and instead of victory, they found silence, suspicion, and despair. For some, surrender to the Americans had saved their lives. For others, it marked the beginning of an identity crisis that would haunt them for decades. The German army had prided itself on discipline and loyalty. To surrender, especially in such numbers, had once been unthinkable. Now, it was a historical fact. For years after the war, German veterans struggled with that reality. Some said they had no choice. Others felt they had betrayed their comrades. But most agreed on one thing. Surrendering to the Americans was the only way to survive the end of a war they could no longer believe in. In the United States, the POWs slowly integrated into American life during their captivity. They learned English, played soccer, built furniture, and even held concerts. Some camps organized schools where officers taught math, history, and literature. The American Guards encouraged it. They saw education as a step towards rebuilding Europe.
When the guns of war fell silent and the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, Germany was not just defeated, it was destroyed. The once proud cities of Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were reduced to blackened skeletons of stone and steel. The roads were clogged with refugees, orphans, and soldiers trying to find their way home through a landscape of rubble. The air still smelled of smoke and dust. For millions of Germans, the war was over, but survival had only just begun. In those early months after surrender, Germany was a place without identity, without leadership, and without hope. Every man and woman carried the scars of war, physical, emotional, and moral. The Nazi regime that had promised greatness left only ruin. And as Allied forces divided the nation into zones of occupation, the German people faced a question more difficult than any they had encountered before. What now? For the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had surrendered to the Americans, the return home was both a relief and a shock. They came back to shattered homes, destroyed cities, and a society that no longer knew who it was. Some families didn't recognize the men who returned. Others had no one left to welcome them. The once unbreakable pride of the German soldier was replaced with quiet shame. And yet, amid this devastation, something unexpected began to grow. A cautious sense of rebirth, guided not by the hands of German leaders, but by those of their former enemies. The American occupation was unlike anything Germany had ever seen. The U.S. military government, under General Dwight Eisenhower and later General Lucius Clay, faced an enormous challenge: how to rebuild a nation that had not only lost a war, but had also lost its moral compass. Punishment alone could not repair what had been broken. The Americans understood that. What Germany needed was transformation, from dictatorship to democracy, from fear to freedom, from hatred to humanity. In the beginning, the occupation was strict. Nazi leaders were hunted down and arrested. Symbols of the old regime were banned. The Allies held the Nuremberg trials to bring war criminals to justice, a powerful message that crimes committed under orders would no longer be excused. For the German population, it was a painful reckoning, a mirror held up to the nation's conscience. But the Americans didn't stop at justice. They focused on something even more revolutionary: rebuilding trust. They knew that the future of Europe depended on a stable, peaceful Germany, and to achieve that, they needed to win not just control, but hearts and minds. One of the most important steps was education. The U.S. occupation authorities began what they called denazification. Schools were reopened under new leadership. textbooks rewritten to remove Nazi ideology, and teachers retrained to promote democratic values. Newspapers and radio stations were reestablished with strict oversight, ensuring that propaganda was replaced by truth. For many Germans, this was the first time they were exposed to uncensored information about what their government had really done. Photographs of concentration camps, testimonies of survivors, and reports of atrocities were shown publicly. The truth was painful, but it was necessary. Only by confronting it could the nation begin to heal. Meanwhile, the American soldiers who had once fought these people were now helping them rebuild. Engineers restored bridges and railways. Medics treated civilians in makeshift hospitals. Aid convoys brought food and medical supplies. Even in the smallest villages, children began to see American uniforms not as symbols of fear, but of hope. For former POWs who had surrendered to the Americans, this transformation was deeply personal. They had experienced firsthand the discipline and fairness of their captors. Now, seeing those same Americans help rebuild their homeland gave them a new sense of respect and gratitude. In 1947, the United States took an even greater step, the Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall. This plan became one of the most ambitious reconstruction efforts in history. The idea was simple but powerful: to rebuild Europe's economies, restore stability, and prevent the spread of communism from the East. Germany, though technically an enemy state, became one of the biggest beneficiaries. Billions of dollars worth of food, machinery, and industrial aid poured into the country. Factories reopened, railways were repaired, power returned to cities that had been dark for years. The American approach was not revenge, it was recovery. They believed that a prosperous, democratic Germany was the best defense against another war. The results were astonishing. Within just a few years, the West German economy began to rise from the ashes. This period came to be known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Streets once filled with rubble echoed again with the sound of hammers and construction. People found jobs, homes were rebuilt, and shops reopened. For the first time since the 1930s, there was optimism in the air. And behind that optimism were countless individuals, former soldiers, widows, and refugees who worked tirelessly to rebuild their lives. Many of them carried memories of surrendering to the Americans, memories of fear turned into mercy. Those experiences shaped how they viewed the new world forming around them. In interviews years later, many former German POWs spoke about how their time in American captivity changed their perspective. They had seen the value of freedom, the power of fairness, and the dignity of democracy. When they returned home, they brought those ideas with them. They taught their children that strength wasn't about conquest, but about cooperation. Some of them even became local leaders in the new West German government. Others became teachers, engineers, and businessmen who helped rebuild their communities. Quietly, their stories helped lay the moral foundation for the modern German identity, one built not on domination, but on peace. The contrast between East and West Germany made the American influence even more visible. In the East Zone, life was different. Resources were seized, industries dismantled, and strict political control enforced. While East Germans faced surveillance and shortages, West Germans, under American guidance, experienced a new kind of freedom. The two halves of the nation became a living example of what the world had become, a battle between tyranny and democracy, fear and hope. In the 1950s, as NATO formed and the Cold War intensified, West Germany emerged as one of America's strongest allies. The same nation that once sent millions to war now sent engineers, scientists, and diplomats to work alongside the U.S. The transformation was almost unbelievable.
By the early 1950s, the ruins of World War II were slowly fading into memory, replaced by cranes, factories, and hope.
Germany was no longer a defeated nation crawling through rubble. It was becoming something new, something unexpected. And standing beside it, guiding and watching carefully, was the United States of America. The story of how these two former enemies became partners is one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. Barely a decade earlier, American and German soldiers had fought each other in the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. Yet, within a few short years, they were allies, working together to rebuild Europe and defend it against a new threat rising from the East. That threat was the Soviet Union. When World War II ended, the uneasy alliance between the U.S., Britain, and the Soviet Union quickly unraveled. The shared goal of defeating Hitler was gone, and what replaced it was a deep mistrust between East and West. The Soviet Union wanted to spread its communist ideology across Europe, while the United States sought to protect democracy and freedom. And at the center of that struggle stood Germany, a divided nation, a living symbol of the world's new Cold War. In 1949, two Germanys were born. The western zones of occupation, controlled by the U.S., Britain, and France, became the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. The eastern zone, under Soviet control, became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. The Iron Curtain had fallen, cutting the heart of Europe in two. For the German people, this division was both physical and emotional. Families were split. Friends disappeared behind borders. The once unified homeland was now separated by barbed wire, walls, and ideology. But in the West, something extraordinary began to happen. Under the guidance of the Americans and their allies, West Germany rose from devastation to become a pillar of democracy and prosperity. The seeds planted during the occupation years, education reform, political freedom, and the Marshall Plan began to bear fruit. Factories roared back to life, cities were rebuilt, and millions found work. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, turned West Germany into the engine of Europe's recovery. By the mid-1950s, its economy was booming, its currency stable, and its future secure. But beyond the material progress, something deeper was taking shape. The German people were rebuilding their identity, not as a nation of conquest, but as a nation of cooperation. The shadow of Nazism still loomed large, but it no longer defined them. Instead, a new kind of pride emerged. Pride in rebuilding, in democracy, in peace. For the Americans, this transformation was both strategic and moral. They saw West Germany not just as a country to be helped, but as a partner in the fight for freedom. The rise of the Soviet Union and its control over Eastern Europe made it clear that the world was once again divided, this time not by nations, but by ideas. In 1949, the same year West Germany was founded, the United States led the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance designed to defend Western nations against Soviet aggression. At first, Germany was not a member. The wounds of war were still too fresh. But the Americans knew that a strong, democratic Germany was essential for Europe's defense. It took 6 years of debate, negotiation, and trust building, but in 1955, West Germany officially joined NATO. The symbolism was powerful. Just 10 years after surrendering to the U.S. Army, German soldiers were now part of an alliance commanded by the United States, an alliance not dedicated to conquest, but to protecting peace. This moment marked the true reconciliation between the two nations. For the Americans, it proved that their post-war policy of rebuilding instead of revenge had succeeded. For the Germans, it was a second chance, a chance to serve the world not as destroyers, but as defenders. The relationship between the two countries deepened rapidly. American culture flooded into West Germany. Jazz, Coca-Cola, blue jeans, Hollywood films, and baseball. But more than that, American ideals, freedom of speech, equality, and democracy took root in German society. For young Germans who had grown up under dictatorship, these ideas were intoxicating. They represented everything their parents' generation had been denied. Meanwhile, in East Germany, life under Soviet control was very different. There were no elections, no freedom of press, and no economic miracle. The state controlled every aspect of life. People who tried to flee were arrested or killed. By the early 1960s, nearly 3 million East Germans had escaped to the West through Berlin, seeking the freedom and opportunity that America had created. To stop them, the Soviet-backed government built the Berlin Wall in 1961, a concrete symbol of division that would stand for nearly 30 decades. On one side of the wall stood the East, gray, silent, controlled. On the other stood the West, bright, free, and alive. And at the heart of that freedom was the American presence. Tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers remained stationed in West Germany not as occupiers, but as protectors. Bases in Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Ramstein became symbols of security and cooperation. American and German soldiers trained together, worked together, and stood side by side in defense of a shared cause. For many Germans, especially those who remembered surrendering to the Americans in 1945, the sight of U.S. troops walking peacefully through their towns was almost surreal. These were no longer the enemies of the past, but the guardians of peace. The children who once watched tanks roll through bombed streets now grew up alongside American families, learning English in school, listening to Elvis on the radio, and dreaming of a future without war. This new bond went beyond politics. It became personal. Marriages between German and American citizens became common. Exchange programs in universities connected students across the Atlantic. The wounds of war were healing, not through speeches or treaties, but through human connection. At the same time, the memory of what had happened during the war was not forgotten. In fact, the Americans encouraged remembrance. Memorials were built, documentaries aired, and survivors were given platforms to tell their stories. Unlike in the years immediately after the war, Germany now faced its past with honesty. The goal was no longer to bury the truth, but to learn from it. The Americans respected this approach because it reflected their own values. The two nations, once on opposite sides of morality, were now aligned in purpose: to ensure that tyranny, hatred, and genocide would never again take root in Europe. By the 1970s, West Germany had become one of America's strongest allies. It played a vital role in NATO, supported U.S. diplomacy, and became a hub of Western industry and innovation. German companies like Volkswagen, Siemens, and BMW flourished, often exporting goods directly to the U.S. The two nations were now bound not by war, but by trade, technology, and trust. For the former soldiers who had surrendered 30 years earlier, this world would have been unimaginable. The country they fought for was gone, but in its place stood a Germany they could be proud of, a Germany that had learned from its mistakes, embraced democracy, and earned respect on the global stage.